So what do you do if a problem is too hard? You restrict it to some special case. And indeed, in this case, it's even biologically helpful to restrict the problem a bit further. And the reason is basically in the pictures that we've seen before. If you look at these roadkill diagrams, what do you not see are crossing lines corresponding to the pairs or the backbone. It just runs nicely through here. And if you want to say it in other terms, it's a planar graph. And it's in a way even more restrictive. So first of all, it seems reasonable that we don't need crossings from the one example I've shown you. And indeed, it's true that most pairs that you find in real structures don't have crossings. It's also true that whenever in biology there's a rule, there's some counterexamples. So sometimes crossing structures exist, but the crossing only involves few pairs. And so we still get a reasonable information about the overall structure if we ignore the crossing pairs and focus on getting the other ones right. And it turns out the right formalization here really is an outer planar graph. If you think about the backbone as part of the graph, outer planar means there's no crossings, the edges never cross. There's a way to draw the graph so that you can align the vertices. Edges are straight lines, they never cross. Straight line is not important, but they never cross. Plus, the outer planar means all the vertices are adjacent to one face. And in this case, we can always draw it that it is the outer face, the part of the space that extends to infinity. Whereas, so I don't know, maybe let me sketch this a bit more. Here's our vertices. In an outer planar graph, I can connect these inside here. It's in principle also allowed to do more than a matching, even though we will never have that here. I can have things nested, but I can't have an edge like this. That's not allowed because it crosses another edge. And outer planar seems to be a good match for the structures that occur. And it has another good feature. It makes the whole thing tractable. The opposite, if you cannot draw a structure in the graph form like this, then it's called a pseudo-knotted structure. It's a pseudo-knot because it isn't actually a knot in the sense of topology. It's just twisted around. For example, you could have a structure like this, where you have pairs here and you have pairs here. Okay, let me draw it a bit more careful. Maybe you have here and here you have bonds. Then this you cannot draw as an outer planar graph. There's vertices inside here that would be cut off from the outer face, but it's still not a real knot. It's one nice line. So these are pseudo-knots, but for outer planar, we'll ignore those. So we'll focus on pseudo-knot-free structures. There's biological motivation for that as well. First of all, the structure is in 3D. If you restrict it to 2D, it's not so far away, hopefully. It's also a useful coarse graining of the structure because it focuses you on these long stems, which tend to be the most dominant feature in stabilizing the molecule anyways. This coarse graining might also, remember the video, hint you better at the pathway to get to that folding as opposed to just showing the final result. And the last point, of course, for us is useful. If we want algorithms that find a structure, then we need to pick a restriction of the problem where we can give such algorithms. So in a way, I should say this is so widely accepted that if you, in general, look for RNA secondary structures, people implicitly mean pseudo-knot-free. You have to explicitly include pseudo-knots in the language because it's so widely used and so widely accepted that you can't deal with pseudo-knots in general, that people will understand pseudo-knot-free as the default. Let's study these kind of structures a bit more. There's the way the roadkill diagrams we had before, the way also Eterna draws the molecules. Biologists give these different kind of shapes a name, and maybe it's worth to point this out once. So there's the stems that we already had, which is just these stacked pairs. They're the most important feature. Then there's HL here, this hairpins, where you turn around. These look boring because they're not paired, but for the biologists, these are the interesting regions because those tend to be the ones that stick out and that can do a function. So oftentimes say in a tRNA, these bases in the hairpin are the ones that are highly preserved between different species because they might do the translation from genetic code to protein or amino acid. Whereas for the rest, for the stems, we don't care so much what letters make the stem as long as they stabilize it. And so often here you find mutations as long as they're so that the partner is mutated correspondingly. Then there's three other features. There's bulges, that's the B. When you have a stem interrupted on one side, you can have interior loops. That's a bulge on both sides. And the last one is this multi-loop, where you have more than one pair reachable from this. In terms of the graph, planar graph terminology, these are just the faces of the graph. Right? If you draw it like this, then the edges separate the plane into several faces. There's the outer face, and then there's these small faces of the stacked pairs. There's the bigger faces of these multi-loops, and so on and so forth. Okay. I don't care too much about these names, but if you read in biology sources, they often refer to these names. Now imagine you take this picture and you pull the backbone onto a circle. That means you pull away these, so these all need to move a bit outwards so that they follow the line here of the circle. That means this outermost stem is corresponding to these, maybe I could use some color. This stem corresponds to these pairs, right? And you can work out where the others go. In that representation, it's even more obvious that this is outer planar. That's the way people draw outer planar graphs. If you want to highlight that they're outer planar, because you see obviously all vertices are adjacent to the outer face and no crossings for the edges. I consider this as an intermediate stage because now if you have the circle, it's not actually closed, right? Because this is a linear structure. Let's take the circle and pull it straight. Then you get to this picture. Again, the same structure. And now you have these arcs on top. And again, it's outer planar if and only if you could draw it as a line with non-intersecting arcs all on one side of the line. And hopefully you can visually see how these all correspond to the same structure. That brings me to the last representation, which looks very innocent. Bloop, down there it is. From this linear arrangement, very easy to see. You can represent edges by opening and closing parentheses, and the other bases just as dots for unpaired. And then this string of opening, closing, and dot, that's completely describing the structure. So if you want to work in a computer with these structures, clearly that's the way to go, right? Then it's just a string, much less hassle than dealing with these pictures. But biologists, of course, prefer those because they are closer to the structure in three-dimensional space. Yeah, also note that precisely the fact that these arcs are all above the line and don't cross means that you just have to find the corresponding parenthesis. The matching parenthesis is your partner in the matching. Okay. Now you could do all sorts of combinatorics with this. You could say we can count how many structures there are. You could find out that while there's clearly 4 to the n different sequences, there's a good deal fewer secondary structures. So a good hint that there's always going to be exponentially many sequences for the same structure, and so on and so forth. We're not going to go there, even though it's fun stuff. Let's come back to algorithms and try to predict a good structure, solving our original problem. Funnily enough, the first algorithm that was somewhat useful for RNA structure prediction, Nusinov's algorithm, did what I originally said is useless, namely it just maximizes the number of pairs. But it maximizes the number of pairs in pseudoknot-free structures, so these outer planar graphs. And there, of course, you can still solve maximum matching in polynomial time, but it's restricted to the graph being outer planar. So I don't know if there's an obvious second algorithm apart from the one that I'm going to show you. I will come back to the counting pair stackings because that was the more realistic thing. But I think historically that's correct to say that the algorithm first just counted the number of valid pairs. Any thoughts how you would do this? So think about what you're given as input is the sequence of bases, just the letters. And you're trying to find the best such balanced parenthesis string, and you're maximizing the number of parentheses. How could you possibly get started here? Or what kind of algorithm design pattern might be useful? I'm already hinting at that it's going to be polynomial time, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it further. I mean, whenever a problem looks harder than greedy, it's probably going to be dynamic programming, no? And indeed, the good thing about these balanced parenthesis strings is, suppose I somehow figured out that this pair of parentheses is matching, and I want to have this one. Right, so there's this pair. What I do inside here and what I do outside here, it's going to be independent. There can't be any crossings. So whatever pairs the maximum number of pairs I can throw into this pink part that crosses the arc I decided to put, it's going to be independent of what I do inside here because they can't cross. So there's a natural decomposition. In a bit more structured terms, we'll come to that. Decomposability is the key thing. For a dynamic program, I guess from how I showed it, it's already suggestive that you want to have subsequences or substrings as your subproblems. So formally, we'll have dij to be the maximal number of valid pairs that you can possibly squeeze in any pseudoknot-free structure for this subrange of your RNA. And by solving this for the whole thing, we'll make our way to the solution for R0n. And if you think about how, so I guess the picture is drawn in a way like you add one more base or so. If you have a range I to j, what could the inner part look like? One option is there is a pair ij, and there's maybe a pair inside, but certainly I and j are paired, or I could be unpaired, or j could be unpaired, and then whatever comes inside, recursively resolve it. Or we have some cut point where everything to the left and everything to the right is a separate structure that don't interfere. That's all options. In a way, if you want to see why it's exhaustive, you look at what I and j do. Either they're paired with each other, or one of them is not paired at all, or they're both paired but not with each other. Right? I think this is a bit misleading that I is paired with essentially k minus 1 and j with k plus 1 or so. This is not needed. There's just, there could be a longer stretch, right? I and j are paired with something. So there's going to be some part here, and then there's an arbitrarily long part in between. That doesn't matter as long as I can find one cut point k. So in the recursive programming recurrence, I have the number of pairs I can form is nothing, 0, if I'm too close, if I'm on a tiny piece of the RNA. And otherwise, it's the best among those 4 options. For the first one, I have to check if I can form the pair between I and j. And note, I stole the pictures from one of the books I mentioned on the website where they have I and j inclusive. But to be consistent with the rest of the module, I used here R I inclusive, j exclusive. So this is the pair we would want to make is between Ri and Rj minus 1. I can add another pair if these are in the canonical base pairs, one of the 6 allowed combinations. Otherwise, no. Then I go to the recursively computed structure between those. And for this bifurcation part, I have a maximization over all possible cut points. So clearly, quadratic space is sufficient to store all the subproblems. And because of this maximization here, I have another linear factor in the running time if I don't try to be smarter. Because this algorithm and versions of it are so much used in practice, people tried a lot of tricks to speed up, at least for typical cases, what happens. And oftentimes you can remember what the cut points were in the smaller structures and keep a list of those. So you may not have to iterate through all of them each time. There's a few tricks you can play. But by and large, you're stuck with some higher polynomial running times. So this is indeed tricky to do with very large molecules. Okay, what's left is, number 1, to get this to the more realistic model of counting pair stackings instead of pairs. I have a separate slide, but I think it's actually easier to do with these pictures. It's not at all difficult to count the pair stackings instead of pairs, because all you have to check is whether there's a way to close a pair here and also have this pair there. Now, the way I set up the recursion here, we don't know in the substructure what we did. So we have to remember an extra bit, if you like, whether we close the outermost I, j minus 1, whether those are paired or not. But if you know that, then you could say one option is I close the pair from I to j, and the one just inside also needs to be closed. That's one option. Then I can add one stacking. And in all other options, I don't get a +1.